What's up, you guys? Steve's back again with another video, and today I am bringing you my BFA 8.1 range DPS tier list. Last week I released a melee ranked tier list for BFA 8.1, and a lot of you were waiting for this video to come out. Now, it's been about a week since I posted the last video because there were some recent changes that we saw with some tweakings to a few classes. A couple of the classes were going to be on this tier list, or are, I should say, on this tier list, and I wanted to see how things would play out. But in fact, those changes for both the melee DPS and the range DPS made little to no difference in their overall performance, and if anything, it kind of balanced things out quite a bit. And some of the other classes, I would say, moved up in rankings, were the top classes, those being, as you can see, a little bit of a teaser here, Elemental Shamans and Balance Druids were not really affected too much, I would say, in these rankings. Now, really quickly before I hop into these tiers, you can also see that there's multiple tiers. So if you are somebody who's unfamiliar with how tiers work, typically S+ tier is going to be your highest tier, meaning that there's a big difference between some of those classes and the rest of the other classes, and then you're going to have several tiers down. Now, for this tier list, we only have 4 tiers: S+, S, A, and B. All of these classes, I would say, are somewhat viable. The S tier and the S+ tier are obviously some of the more viable classes, whereas the B tier can still work and the A tier can still work. However, there is somewhat of a difference between the lower end tiers, obviously, and the higher plus tiers, so just keep that in mind. But I wouldn't say that any of these classes are most certainly unplayable to where they will not work in Arena. It's just my overview and my general thought process when I'm looking at these classes, how I would rank them and separate them into several tiers. Now, going right into the S+ tier, we have the 2 top performing range DPS classes. The first one being Elemental Shaman. Now, just the other week, we saw some changes to Elemental Shaman, some of them being nerfed to certain Azerite traits like Lava Shock, which has been nerfed time and time again. I think it's been nerfed almost to like 80% in PvP, but it's still hitting very, very hard. And a lot of shamans are still opting to use Lava Shock. Some shamans are opting to use Natural Harmony, which just buffs various stats when they use certain types of schools of spells like Fire and Frost or whatever. And I would say that even with these changes, Elemental Shamans are still very strong because the amount of damage they are dealing, but the way that they're dealing damage, they have multiple schools of spells, and they have just random bursts of damage that come from different abilities, right? We have things like Earthshock still hitting very, very hard, even though it's been nerfed so many times because of Lava Shock, the Azerite trait that builds up your Earthshock. We also have things like Lightning Overload and Stormkeeper. These are random procs of damage that can absolutely almost global someone. We also have things like Lightning Lasso, if you're unfamiliar with that. Lightning Lasso, I'm sure you've seen. It is a great form of CC that really locks down the enemy and does about 40%. There was also a change to Lightning Lasso recently where it went from 48% damage when inside of Lightning Lasso, if we went for the whole duration, now down to about 40%. But that's still 40% of somebody's life, and it's still a form of CC. They still do great damage once again with their Earthshock burst. They also have amazing off heals, which are very reminiscent of Enhancement Shaman off heals before they got toned down and nerfed. Now, you do have to actually cast these off heals, whereas Enhancement has instant cast off heals, but they still heal for an an incredible amount. I mean, the amount that you can heal is like 30k plus healing surges, and that's great for a range DPS because it gives them great team utility. They also have team utility in things like Sky Fury. They also have team utility in things like Purge. They also have team utility in things like Grounding Totem. They have different elementals to keep people in combat. They can throw down an Earthbind Totem behind a pillar to keep the enemy in combat, and they just have great overall consistent damage and burst damage. They're an all-around, well-rounded class. The only thing that I would say that kind of separates Elemental Shamans from Balance Druids is they're just not as tanky. Now, they do have a very consistent wall and Ancestral Shift, I believe it's the term or the word for their wall. With their off-healing potential and their amount of damage that they're dealing and just their complete toolkit, they still are probably, in my opinion, if I was going to rank between Balance and Elemental Shamans, I would put Elemental Shamans at the top. But the difference between these two classes is not the damage per se, it's just that Balance Druids might be a little bit more tanky and a little bit more passive for a lot of the game, where Elemental Shamans are consistent in their damage, and then they have just random out of nowhere RNG bursts that can just shock you, literally shock you out of nowhere and just take someone out of the map instantly. And because of that, and the fact that we are in a caster meta at the moment, if you're unfamiliar with what that means, we have, you know, 2 ranged casters like an Elemental Shaman and no surprise a Moonkin, and then like a Mistweaver Monk, and we're going to fight something else that's very similar with 2 casters and maybe another Mistweaver Monk or another healer on their team. Elemental Shamans always do good in those matchups because of things like shear, all the interrupts that they do have with grounding, and obviously their knockback effects and their lightning lasso, and they're very disruptive purge. They do well in those types of matchups traditionally, and that's why I'd rank them at the top of the caster list at this moment. There are some melee comps going around right now, but when you're fighting a double caster as a double melee, you get dragged out into dampening. You do not want to be stuck with fighting an Elemental Shaman and a Balanced Druid, as they're hard to take out, and the longer the match goes, it's just the worse that it's going to be for you in the long run. Moving on to Balanced Druids. Balanced Druids still have some of the most insane damage. Star Surge still hits extremely hard, to the point where it's just random 40k procs of damage, random 30k procs of damage. I mean, you can see it coming, but when they line those up, it is extraordinary how much damage they can do. And with Elemental Shamans obviously on your team, you're going to be dealing random procs of burst that's hard to try and play around. Also, things like Incarnation puts you on a timer. Every time you have to survive Incarnation, you're just going to run into a scenario where you run out of time because dampening is going to start racking up. It's going to get hard for your healer to heal through the amount of damage they're dealing, and with the amount of CC that they have with things like Cyclone and Root Beam, it makes it very difficult to survive those difficult situations. And on top of that, if you are able to survive those long CC chains, you're just going to get hit with a huge Star Surge during Incarn, and you're just going to knock somebody right out of the arena. So they're very difficult to play around because of the timer that they put you on. And on top of that, during the time where you are able to do damage, they are very tanky. Killing a Balanced Druid is not easy. They have so many ways to heal themselves, so many ways to survive with like Iron Fur, Frenzy Regen, Renewal, their off-healing potential, Bear Form, Bark Skin. All of these abilities make Balanced Druid so difficult to take down. But if you do not target a Balanced Druid, he's going to spam out Cyclones and deal just absurd damage. And this is what really separates these 2 casters from the rest of the tier. All the other casters on this list, or range classes, are killable. I would say Warlocks are probably one of the more tanky casters as well, but these 2 classes are very difficult to take down. Insane off-healing potential. They're definitely the 2 strongest casters on this list, but keep in mind the date of this video, these classes could easily get nerfed, you know, next week, and they might not be the strongest. But if you do have one of these classes, I recommend picking one of them up or trying to group up with one of these classes, because you're probably going to see or fight a lot of them anyway. So if you can't beat them, then you might as well join them. Now, moving on to the S tier, we have Shadow Priest. Now, Shadow Priests have lost a little bit of their tankiness since 8.1, but they gain things like Greater Fade, which makes them also pretty difficult to take down. It's a different way of, you know, tanking damage. I mean, you can time Greater Fade if you're a good Shadow Priest to, you know, avoid certain types of CC or avoid big attacks. That's also great, rather than just standing there and then never going into Void Form. Now we are using Void Form, which does add a lot of pressure. We also have incredible CC. That is where Shadow Priests shine right now, because of their ability to land things like Silence into Psychic Horror, into Fear, into MC, or some Shadow Priests are opting to play Mind Bomb with like Windwalker Monks. They have a lot of CC potential, and they can put the enemy healer in a huge chain while they're dealing decent amounts of damage. And they also have great team utility with things like Life Swap. We have things like Mass Dispel. I can't spell the spell, but we also have things like Purge. They have great team utility spells. Life Grip, I can't forget that one. They're a solid class to have on your roster. It's very enjoyable to play with the Shadow Priest when you're playing as a healer, because of all the things that they can bring to the table. And they can repeat this CC chain like we talked about a second ago over and over and over again. If you can't kill them in between their survival windows, then you're going to go through one of those CC chains again, and that's very difficult for your healer to recover. So even though Shadow Priests lost some of their tankiness with Edge of Insanity, is what the PvP talent was called, but because we've seen some changes to that and buffs to Void Form, Shadow Priests are no longer taking that talent, but they still have ways to survive because of things like Disperse being buffed and allowing it to, or now healing them almost up to full HP. And I think Shadow Priest paired with any of these casters in the S+ tier make an excellent comp that is difficult to take down and very durable. And this easily makes them one of my top casters in the S tier. Now moving on to Warlocks, no surprise to some people, a big surprise to other players. I would rate Warlocks as one of the top casters, and if we do see more changes to some of the S plus tier classes, those being Elemental Shamans and Balance Druids, I have no problem moving Warlocks into the S plus tier. All specs, those being Destro, Demo, and Affliction, are viable. Destro probably being one of the more prominent specs, Affliction also being a very prominent spec, and Demo still has its place in a lot of comps. It still does very well in 2v2 scenarios. I think Demo is a very underutilized spec, but Destruction has just so many ways to win the match, and it has, once again, that timer that it puts the enemy team on. I don't want to spend too much time going into each of the specs, but they all have a very similar, or at least Destruction and Affliction have a very similar timer mechanic, where Affliction Warlocks have a trait that allows them to suck their opponent dry with Drain Life. If you haven't seen this before, when they use Agony on a target, it builds up these stacks that makes their next Drain Life deal a bonus amount of damage, and they wait for these stacks to build up to about 50, and when they activate their Drain Life, it is simply a one-shot mechanic. Now you can stop this Drain Life, but they can wall for the Drain Life so they can't be interrupted. They can pop their Reflect, their Nether Ward, to make it so they can't be interrupted or CS'd. Now you do have to use things like, maybe if you're a warrior, you might have to Trinket a stun and then Stormbolt the target to try and stop the Drain Life, but there's only so many times you can do that. These moments put you on a timer to where if this Warlock gets off this Drain Life, it will almost one-shot you. Similar to Destruction Warlocks, some Warlocks play a Infernal trait that when they drop their Infernals, their Chaos Bolts deal a bonus amount of damage. They also play a trait, I believe, that comes from Incinerate or Immolate. I believe it is your Immolate, it's your dot. Whenever you're dealing damage with Immolate to a target above 80% health, I believe, you gain a X amount of haste, and if you stack 3 of those, it gives you just a massive, insane amount of haste that makes it so your Chaos Bolts just come out like instant. Now, when this happens, when they pop their Dark Soul, when they pop their Infernals, and they get off maybe 1 or 2 of these Chaos Bolts on you, it will almost one-shot you. A Chaos Bolt can hit anywhere from 50 to 60. I've seen even 80k Chaos Bolts. Now, you have to keep in mind that if you pair a Destruction Warlock with an Elemental Shaman, you pair a Destruction Warlock with a Shadow Priest, or you pair a Destruction Warlock with a Balance Druid, or any of these